Welcome to our weekly 3-minute therapy podcast. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein. I'm a clinical psychologist with a in-person and remote practice, and author of 3-minute therapy. And 3-minute therapy is based exclusively on REBT, rational emotive behavior therapy. And our today, I'm here with my co-host Mick Berry, and we have a guest, Bob Moore, and Bob Moore has had vast experience doing REBT and also experience working with trauma. Bob, did you want to add anything else in introduction?
Oh, you've said it perfectly well. I spent the first 20 years of my career in REBT exclusively until one day I discovered I had a very good grip on the tip of the iceberg and got into trauma work.
Okay, and you trained with Albert Ellis in person, the founder of REBT.
Yeah. I opened his branch down here in Florida.
Is that still is that still there, or has that been closed?
No, it's still here. Vince Parr and colleagues are running it over in Tampa.
Oh, and what's the name of the branch?
The Institute for Rational Emotive Therapy.
I see. Very good. And I was going to ask you something else. Have you written anything on REBT or trauma?
Oh, sure. I should send you a little list, shouldn't I?
Okay, what's the most prominent of your books?
Well, they're chapters. I have the good fortune to be connected with a number of colleagues who do in fact write books, and the pleasure and privilege of putting a chapter here and there into them to define whatever it is they're wanting to look at in the book overall.
Yeah, and you helped Albert Ellis with some of his books when he was putting them in E-Prime. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and E-Prime is English language without any form of the verb to be. And I think quite some time ago, I did a podcast on E-Prime, and we might do one again. So how do you, Bob, how do you define trauma?
In the kind of trauma work that I do, my colleagues and I let the client define it. It's sort of interesting in that regard, because what is traumatic to one person is not necessarily traumatic to another, as you might imagine. So we don't bicker with them about that. They can have, their life can be falling apart. They can have suffered some huge insult, some grievous injury, some incredibly unfortunate circumstance, and dust it off and say, well, that was a bummer. On the other hand, some people will freak out if a roach crawls across their kitchen floor and insist that that's a trauma. And we don't argue with them. It doesn't pay to argue with them.
And so once they tell you that a roach crawled across their kitchen floor and that was a trauma, how do you deal with that?
Well, I need the presentation from the individual, because even those are not all alike. But if they identify any particular experience as traumatic, the assumption is, and they will bear this out in their own testimony, that they're having a variety of very unpleasant personal, emotional, psychological reactions to the occasion, and it's messing up their lives. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in my office, of course.
I see. So it seems to me, and this is going to be the meat of our discussion, that if someone has an unpleasant emotional experience, their emotions come from their thinking. And then if we want to help them with their emotions, we identify their thinking. And if they have an unpleasant emotion, often it's irrational thinking, often in the form of musts and should, some demands, some absolutes.
Yes,
So
well said.
Is that your view also?
Oh, well said. Yes, you nailed it. And we
So
go
then,
in the work that we do with people who consider that they've been traumatized at some point. We take an extra step because we invite them to consider that their thinking, which you correctly identify as faulty, comes from somewhere. In other words, they weren't born with it. They usually have had a variety of experiences that help to program their thinking, and we take an interest in that.
I see. I see. Mick,
Yeah, well, now, Bob, it's my experience that people are born with proclivities for self-defeating thoughts and self-defeating behavior.
yeah, or to put it a little differently, we all, being human, we all have a tendency to escalate our preferences, and especially our strong, passionate preferences, into demands.
Right. No, you said it well, Mick. We are all vulnerable in that regard.
Yeah, but I
We
believe
have the tendency to pick up from our environment, the key people in our lives, especially when we're young, to pick up all sorts of errant attitudes and values and beliefs and expectations
right.
and priorities, and we're just programmable as heck,
Yeah, right. And so we find people who affirm our erroneous beliefs, but we also might find people who will present arguments against our erroneous beliefs, and we could end up getting rid of our erroneous beliefs through learning. And that's certainly what therapy attempts to do, teach
Right.
somebody to think differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, it seemed to me, Bob, that so far we agree on everything, but it seemed to me we had some disagreement about REBT and trauma. Was that your impression?
My impression that, well, here's the thing. Everything we're in agreement about is solid gold as far as I'm concerned. But back in the day, when trauma was not as prominent a clinical issue as it has become, Ellis was very clear about it. I'll just give you a little anecdote in this regard. He said, don't mess with it. If they can walk in and declare themselves to be PTSD, you really, really don't want to go there unless you have some extraordinary skill with dealing with people who are about to become majorly upset and bleed on your carpet. And he didn't want to see that happen because we're not particularly good at doing rational emotive interventions or any other cognitive behaviorist technique if someone is absolutely torn apart and blubbering all the while they're in your office. So he was saying, don't trigger them if at all possible. They can walk into PTSD, okay. Don't trigger them. It's like saying, don't go there. All right. So he wanted to stay largely in present time because, after all, whatever the event, the traumatic event could have been considerable, very old thing, a long time ago. But if they're having trouble today, and if they're in your office today, they're looking at a bundle of irrational thinking right now, and that's where you want to put your attention. Don't put your attention on its derivation in something that's going to turn them into a slobbering mess. Yeah.
Yes, Mick.
Yeah. Well, if we call an event a traumatic event, REBT would say no event is in itself traumatic in the sense of debilitating us mentally. It's how we view it. Now, I'd say there are some events which are most likely more difficult for most people, such as in World War I, there was people that experienced shell shock. Some people didn't, some people did, but it's certainly not an easy thing to deal with if you're under fire from people trying to kill you. I'd say that's about as likely a scenario of a situation that you would find emotionally upsetting as anything, because
Sure.
the stakes are high and the threat is so enormous.
Oh my God, I'm about to die.
Yeah, but
even there,
in itself,
Yeah, even there, you have a
What?
choice. Even in a situation like that, and Viktor Frankl chose not to disturb himself about it. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and he showed that he gave a different meaning to his stay in the concentration camps, which, as a psychiatrist, was to help the other people there. I'm sorry for interrupting you, Mick. Go on.
Yeah, well, and actually, as far as Viktor Frankl goes, an interesting note about that. My sister's a college professor, and she was hiring somebody who did research on Viktor Frankl, and he had sound research which concluded that Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp all of 3 days. So I don't think he's the best candidate. Now we can investigate that. Perhaps that's not true, but nevertheless, he's not the only example of that. People survive very extremely life-threatening situations, and they don't have mental hang-ups about it. And some people simply have, as Bob was saying, can have mental hang-ups about a cockroach crawling across the floor, or walking over a bridge, or getting in an elevator, or simply going outside of their house.
Right.
So it is within our own thinking that determines how we perceive something to be traumatic.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So we learn how to think about things differently so that we are not living under the experience of perennial anxiety.
Right.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
as Mick was saying, Bob, and I wonder if you agree, there's no such thing as a traumatic event. Because as you said, Bob, people describe trauma as freaking out, very intense, unpleasant emotions. And as we know, our emotions come from our thinking about events, not from events themselves.
That's right.
So to be semantically precise, we wouldn't refer to anything as a traumatic event. We'd refer to things as an event that
Right.
some people traumatize themselves about it.
Yeah. Yeah. You correctly identify how we speak. Now, how the client speaks when they walk in, they talk about traumatic events. Now we
Right.
we know better, as you perfectly well say, but that's not an invitation to immediately make them wrong about their presentation. So one of the things you learn when you're working with people who have been significantly traumatized and are eligible for re-stimulation the moment they walk into your office is you try not to essentially sabotage their argument by saying, well, actually, you've got it wrong. You see, there is no such thing as a traumatic event. So let me start out by just correcting you here, okay, and immediately go into a kind of adversarial relationship with their thinking. That will come later, okay? That will come later. Yeah.
Yeah. So we practice differently. But Mick, you wanted to say something?
Well, couldn't you say to them, well, I'm glad you're here, and I want to give you the hope because I know that you're going to be able to deal with this, and I can teach you how. When would you like to start?
Yeah,
love it.
and in that optimistic note of mix to a client, I also say, I have some good news. There's a way you can stop disturbing yourself. So I don't make them wrong or be very critical, but I present it in a very positive light.
Excellent. I'll go even farther, Mick, because not only do we tell them, how would it be, so to paraphrase you, if you didn't have, if you could handle all of this, if you found a way to not become the victim of this roach or death threat or whatever it is, okay, but you actually didn't have any particular residual reaction to it anymore. And I'll offer them that kind of hope.
Yeah, very good, Mick.
I'll even go so far as to say, I am as capable as anybody of disturbing myself, and it's something that we all do as human beings, and I'm the perfect example of it. And highly, highly disturbed. And so I can teach you how I was able to get over my disturbance.
Yeah, you can
Yep.
do that if you have the right kind of background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's that difficult actually. If you can, one thing I've found though, if you're a licensed therapist, people tend to listen to you more, which is kind of silly because as an unlicensed non-therapist, I can say just because you're licensed doesn't mean you know what the hell you're doing. But people tend to listen to somebody if they're a licensed therapist. People don't listen to me that much, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know what you mean.
send them to me and Bob, and they'll listen.
Yeah, over time, I've developed a response to people, potential clients who call and say, "Do you have a woman on your staff? Do you have anybody on your staff who has had a trauma? Do you have?" They're looking for a therapist who has the same disorder they've got, because they think that makes them extra specially able to help them. And I don't think they do that with their cardiologist. I'm not
Yeah.
going to go to a
Right.
cardiologist who
Yeah,
hasn't
good
had a heart
point.
attack, you know?
Yeah, because many people come to therapy to be understood, and that's it, to have a shoulder to cry on, someone who has compassion and is caring,
Yeah.
rather than shows them how to change things. Yes, Mick?
Well, I think even if that is what they want, it qualifies to say, I'm a fallible human being just like you, and I can teach you how to be less fallible and more self-helping and less self-defeating. We're all in the same boat there. Just by being you know what you're doing, you can help somebody else. So even if you're looking for that affinity, it's right there. It doesn't have to be the same exact experience.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, very good. I was hoping for a wild and woolly discussion, but it looks like we largely agree on everything. But I think that's fine.
Well, Bob, let me ask you this. I
Yeah.
run into so many people who are, I'm in the arts, and I find people in the arts tend to go the route of Freud. And I think because of the mystery behind it, and not everybody, of course, but I run into so many people who think that all mental disturbance comes from childhood abuse in their childhood. And it's just not true. It's the way we think about things that disturbs us. Do you encounter that very often?
Do I encounter people who think that their disturbances came from childhood abuse?
Yeah.
Well, if they have in fact been significantly abused as children, there's a very good likelihood that that unfortunate experience contributed to their being screwed up. But that doesn't change the facts that there are people who are abused who react with a lifetime's worth of pain, and there are people who have been abused who don't.
But
And so we're interested in the difference being the way they have learned to think about their experience.
yeah, well, what I find is people who have no evidence of any childhood abuse are convinced that it must have occurred because they're so disturbed.
Forgive me, the audio is being corrupted for some reason, and I'm
Yeah,
not
your
understanding
audio is
you.
being corrupted, and I think that's a good note to conclude on. But I wanted to thank you, Bob, for joining us. This has been an interesting discussion with a therapist who deals with clients who say they have been traumatized. Uh, so it's useful to hear your experiences and learn from your experiences. Thank you, Mick, my co-host. Sorry about the connection at the end there.
Okay.
And I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, clinical psychologist, and I have a book, 3minutetherapy.com. Bob, do you want to tell us, do you have a website?
I don't have a website, no.
I see. Okay. And do you want to mention one book where you have a chapter? Nothing comes to mind right now.
Well, several, except that I need to pull them out and take a look at which one would be most relevant to what we've been talking about. Why don't I send you, if you want that that information, let me send it to you. Okay.
Okay.
Some of the ones that we revised in ePrime are valuable in this connection. But I'm thinking more of Wendy Dryden's book. You know the name Wendy Dryden?
Oh, I know Wendy. I knew Wendy personally. Yes.
Yeah, well, he's been a prolific writer, and I made some contributions to his work. I put chapters related to, as a matter of fact, chapters related to trauma into one of his books, the title of which now escapes me. It's been some years.
Yeah,
So,
and
but
that's Dryden, Dryden, Wendy Dryden.
yep.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Bob, again for joining us. Thanks,
My
Mitch,
pleasure.
for your participation. And thank you, Chris Rossini, our tech engineer behind the scenes. If you have thoughts about our discussion, comment below. If you got something out of it, give us a thumbs up. Suggest subjects if you'd like us to discuss something in the future. And if you'd like to volunteer, Bob survived being a volunteer and a guest here. So I'm sure you would too. And subscribe to the 3 Minute Therapy podcast to stay on the rational side of life.